Hello, folks. It's good to have you with us tonight. Tonight we are going to continue our Lenten study using and reading the book by Henry Nouwen called The Return of the Prodigal Son. And then we'll be looking at the painting of the same name and reading the part of the scripture story tonight as well as a part of this time to consider how it is that we are like the younger son, the older son, and the father in the story of the prodigal son. So if you've been with us for the last few weeks, we're going to be looking at chapters 7 through 9. If you've not been following along in the book with us, that's okay. You'll be just fine joining us in midstream in this study. I'll say more in a little bit about how we're going to do that when we get to the discussion and study part together. But want to remind you, if you are a visitor tonight, please join us for worship this Sunday at 10 a.m. We're online and in person. And you can find out all the information about how to stay connected with us at our church website. For our folks at the church, be sure you check your emails today. There is an update from our task team about some in-person opportunities that we've not had in a while in terms of small group gatherings and those kind of things. I'll spare you the details in this moment, but just would encourage you to take a moment to look at your emails today to know how we're going to be doing that. Essentially, after Easter and after spring break, we're going to begin to offer some more opportunities for Sunday school and small group gatherings and continue some of the fellowship opportunities we have as well. So as we begin this study tonight, I want to begin with a word of prayer, and that prayer will be on your screen, or you may have also received the study guide this week, which will include the prayer as well. So I invite you now to pray with me and to read this prayer together aloud as well. God of love and mercy, open our hearts to your presence tonight. Remind us that you are the source of our eternal salvation, and your love reaches us wherever we are. Give us the strength to respond faithfully to your boundless love, that the joy of your salvation might shine in and through us all. Wipe away our wrongdoing, clean our hearts, and make us more perfect. For it is in your perfect love that we are drawn more fully into your image. In the name of the glorified Christ, we pray. Amen. I want to invite you to read with me a responsive reading from Psalms. This is from Psalm 51, verses 1 through 10. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you, you alone, have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are justified in your sentence, and blameless when you pass judgment. Indeed, I was born guilty, a sinner when my mother conceived me. You desire truth in the inward being. Therefore, teach me wisdom in my secret heart. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sins, and blot out all my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and put a new and right spirit within me. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So as we continue our story of the prodigal son and the return of the prodigal son, I'm going to read an excerpt of that story that we have revisited for the last 3 weeks. And so hear these words. We're going to read from chapter 15, verse 20 through 32. So he set off and went to the father. But while he was still far off, the father saw him, and he was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his slaves, Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field. And when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has got him back safe and sound. Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet for all these years but you have never given me a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours come back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him. Then the father said to him, Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So as we get into our discussion tonight, I want to remind you of for us to converse with one another. Tonight we have Lee, who will be checking Facebook, and Julie will be looking at YouTube. So if you're on either of those platforms tonight, and would love for you to respond with comments or questions or responses to the questions that I want to ask you. And for the handful of us who are here tonight, you all are free to chime in with us as well, and we share. And for those who are in the room with us, if they share, I'm going to do all I can to repeat back what I hear so that you can follow along with that conversation. So as we get into this image or this conversation tonight, thank you for Kyle for putting the image on the screen for us. Want to have that in front of us the whole time because we are focusing on Rembrandt's painting here, and perhaps it by itself can prompt some questions for us. And that's how I want to begin, by looking at that painting together And I want to begin and return back to a question about the images of God that we have and the ideas of God that we have or grow up with, or that for various reasons that we have had concepts of God. So I want to come back to the question of how have experiences in your life shaped some of your ideas, your images, and expectations that you have of God. So let's begin by looking at the painting together. And remember some of the things that we've talked about that this painting has prompted for us over the last few weeks. There's a lot of imagery that we've talked about. Now, in this painting, Nouwen offers that it contains everything in the human story and God's story with us. And he says that in this painting, we have this intersection of sin and forgiveness, of pride and humility, and it is both fully human and it's fully divine. And in one picture, we have that in this image of who God is, and here, primarily, an image of God as the Father in the story. And he makes the point that much of our faith story and our understanding of God, the ideas of God that we have, it can be hard for us to explain those. It's hard to give someone our experiences or understandings of God. But he says this painting is it's specific, it's concrete, and you can even describe this to someone. Now, personally, I love art, and I think things like photography and music and poetry and paintings, like we're looking at, they can be very helpful in conveying our story in both concrete and ways that lead us to ponder. And maybe because artists paint them, because artists give us these images out of their own expression, their own ideas of who God is. So Rembrandt is giving us, quite literally, one of the images of God that he has. And I would offer that when we look at this painting, you really don't have to know anything about the story. You don't have to have read, you would not have had to have read Nouwen's book. You may have never heard of the prodigal son in your life. But you can look at this painting and you can understand that there's tragedy here, that there's beauty, that there's brokenness, and that there's love. It's obvious when you look at this, those are the major themes in this painting, whether you know the story or not. There's mercy here. It's just there. You don't have to look for it. And so immediately, that prompts me to think about, how have I experienced that in life? And if you are familiar with the story and Rembrandt's painting and the book that we're reading, this is another image of God. And so with that, one more story that Nouwen mentions that Rembrandt often painted. He mentions that he painted a lot of figures of someone named Tobit and the nearly blind Simeon. Now Tobit, who is Tobit? It's not a story that I'm familiar with, and why would he paint that so often? It's kind of an obscure book, and in fact, it's not in the canon of the Bible. It's part of the Apocrypha, which is kind of an extra reading written at that time that gives you some context about what was going on in the lives of those who did write the Bible. So it has a lot of value for us, but it's an allegory in itself. Well, Tobit, it turns out, as I went to read about Tobit was a faithful man. And he did a lot of good things, merciful things for people. But Tobit had a hard life. There's a kind of a strange story that Tobit lost his sight after sleeping outside all night, and it's kind of gross, but bird droppings fell on his face and he was blind. Strange story. I'm like, okay, why is this story so important? Why was it so important to Rembrandt? Well, Tobit had a family member named Sarah, who at the very same time, both of them had given up on life. Turns out in that story, Tobit and Sarah, the characters, represent Israel, who had been in exile. And at the end of the story, God sends an angel named Raphael. And Raphael redeems and heals everyone in the story. So Tobit's meant to give us yet one more expression of who God is. God is someone who comes to you when it looks like everything has been lost and rescues you. Every bit of that is in this story, if we look at that. This is God rescuing, again, someone who has been lost. And one more quote in the book, and then I'm going to come back to our question. But now unwrote in this idea and image of God, that as Rembrandt's own life moved toward the shadow of an old age, as his success wanes and the exterior splendor of his life diminished, he comes more in touch with the immense beauty of the interior life. And perhaps the reason that Nouwen painted as he did, because not only in these images do we see God, there's a self-portrait too. So for Rembrandt, this idea of an aging God became very important for him. He related to God, and he understood God's image in that. So let me pause for a moment. And what are some of the things for you all? How have experiences in your life shaped some of your ideas and images and expectations of God that you have? And I would add to that, how is that important to us today? So what are some images and what are some experiences that help you define who God is? A good question would have been, how would you paint God? What would your Rembrandt painting be of God? Any immediate thoughts?
Not yet.
All right.
I don't think he's got his
Okay. So is that something that you would have thought about God? Okay. When I as a kid, I had a Bible that was my dad's Bible. And it was King James, red letters, had images of Jesus. Jesus had blonde hair and blue eyes. And so as a kid, when I read that, I thought that that's how Jesus talked. I thought that's what Jesus looked like. And I knew by reading that Bible that his words were more important than anyone else's. So I had this idea from just that Bible of what Jesus looked like. Now I got older, and I learned things, and I matured, and I realized Jesus didn't look anything like that. He didn't say thee and thou a lot. That just didn't reflect who he was, and so began to wonder about that. But if you were to ask me today what ideas or images of God, I probably more readily go back to the book of Genesis, and where we read that it says that we were all created in the image of God. And so rationally, as I think about that, when I'm in a crowd, when I look at my congregation on Sunday morning, when I meet a stranger, sometimes I remember that. Oh, this is what God looks like. God looks like all of this. And then I think about all the different experiences that people have in life. Well, that person's experience is going to define or shape how they understand God, just like mine have. Someone, for example, someone who has been redeemed in life, they would tell you that God is redemptive. For someone who has endured hardships in life but always felt God's presence, perhaps they're going to tell us that God is faithful, that God is lasting and enduring. So for me, that image of God is, I like to see that in everyone else. And Jesus even said that. Jesus said, if you want to see me, you're going to see me in the face of those that you serve in the world. So that's my immediate response to that question as well.
Sandra says, in the book, The Heart of God, I like the quote, "It is not I that chose God, but God had first chose me. That is the great mystery of our faith." What a blessing.
Yeah, I'm going to come to that very quote in the book later on as well, that God choosing us. So God is, in that image, is someone who pursues us as well. Yeah.
I think my first image of God, I was blessed with a very wonderful father who was a man of God, and I saw him pray several times a day. He was always present in our life at all of our activities, always there, encouraging, loving, compassionate. So that was my image of who God the Father was, because I had an amazing father. But I know other people didn't have that, and then they struggle with bad relationships with their earthly father, so they can't see that the same way. But I was just blessed that I had someone that showed me how awesome God was.
Yeah. There we go. Went off. Yeah, so and as I hear you say that, Lee, I'm thinking you learned that there was other images of God because of your experiences with others. And later on, I'm going to kind of highlight that for many of us, we're going to talk in a little bit about this motherly and fatherly figure that that we find in this painting. And depending on our circumstances, our experiences, that can be helpful or not so helpful. And for me, that's one of those moments that I realize and appreciate there's just a broad idea of who God is that perhaps all of us can gravitate to as well. Yeah. Any other online comments?
Mark Levy actually just sent a message that says he's asking about the woman and saying that she seems reluctant to welcome the young son.
Yeah, the one in the background there. Is that the one? I have a feeling that's the one he's talking about. She does seem reluctant, though. Yeah, and Marv, one of the things that we talked about is it seems as though everyone's at a different distance. And I wonder, and I think we can ponder, and I think this is the beauty of art, whether or not Rembrandt meant it or not. Perhaps one takeaway that I have is we'll all find ourselves feeling more or less distant to God. And the closer you are, the brighter your face is in this story. So the closer we might be, perhaps that speaks to us as well. So I have a feeling that's what Rembrandt had in mind when he painted that as well. Yeah, good stuff. Well, let's continue to talk about the Father, and I want to talk about the Father having an undivided love, or fullness of God's love. And I want to come back to the question: what can we learn from the Father in this story, in this painting, about what an undivided love looks like? And I'll flesh that idea of an undivided love out a little bit more. But want to, yet again, and I don't think I picked up on this the first time I read this book years ago, but there's so many stories that we can relate to this other than the story of the prodigal son. Nowen reflects on the red cape of the Father as we look at that. And he said that when he went to gaze at the red cloak, it was almost like a tent. But then he said he had this other image, like the sheltering wings of a mother bird. And you kind of get that as you looked at that, but there's this sense that he's wrapping him with his robe as he looms over him, and reminded him of Jesus' words about God's maternal love. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often have I longed to gather your children, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you refused. Now, continuing to look at the painting, and prior to this quote in the book, he points out that the Father has two different hands. And if you look at the hands, I think he is onto something, that one does seem more masculine, and the other one perhaps more feminine. And he says that the cloak, that along with the cloak looking like wings to him, that maybe we're being given the idea of a motherly image of God here. So we have an aging man, someone who seems to be near blindness. We have these different kind of hands. We have this cloak that seems like wings. And so you have this image of grief and despair, hope, someone who's endlessly waiting. And so you get this maternal and paternal thought here about God, which adds to the fullness of understanding who God is too, and that image of God. And you also have in this painting three different kinds of hearts. You have two hearts that are divided, and you have one heart that's full. The younger son's heart is divided, or has been divided. And he's been divided by a sense and a desire to be wealthy and famous or independent of his family. The older son has a divided heart because he's expressed jealousy that the father is giving love to such a terrible son. So both of them, for two different reasons, are finding it hard to either accept love or to give love. And we're going to get back to that too. But the father, the parent, the father has a whole heart. And he loves both of these folks. And there's no problem for him to give love to either the one who's been good or bad. He just loves in this story. So the Father is an example and perhaps an image of God here that we can lean into. is that of a God who has an undivided heart for us, not at all in competition with anything that wants us to love. And so I want to get back to this question of what can we learn from the Father about what an undivided love looks like. What would we say an undivided love looks like? Any immediate responses? And I'll kind of share mine. Well, as you think about that, Nouwen said that the world that he grew up in, was full of grades and scores and statistics. And then consciously or unconsciously, he always tried to measure all things. And he said that much sadness and gladness in my life flows directly from comparing. And most, if not all, of this comparing is useless and a terrible waste of time and energy. Our God, who is both Father and Mother to us, does not compare. And so in short, what I hear him saying is love does not compare. And then it made me ponder, where do I sometimes choose to compare in order to either love or to be loved? And so perhaps we can see what others are wearing, maybe their job, and we wonder, well, my job's not as good as that one, or they're more successful. They seem to be more intelligent. They seem to be something more, something different, or vice versa. Well, I seem to be doing better than they are, or I seem to know things, or whatever that may be. We compare, and what we do with that comparison isn't always helpful, if ever. But I feel like I'm at my best when I don't do that. But I think it's a challenge to simply love someone without comparing, because the world often asks us to do that. So I was listening to an interview yesterday with Sam Bush, which you may know. Sam Bush is a mandolin player from this area, and I've always loved his music. And he's telling his story, and he was at the height of his career, and things were going great. But he said, I increasingly discovered that I grew jealous, or I was comparing myself to others. I had done so much more, but they seemed to have more fame than me. He says, even at the height of my career, I was still comparing myself to others. And he said something that reminded me of what Nouwen said. He goes, all that jealousy and pride, that was just wasted emotion. And then it reminded me of our story, that comparing that we do, it's wasted effort. And you see that a father in this story just doesn't compare the two sons. He could, couldn't he? He could compare these two kids, but he just doesn't know how to do that. It's just not part of his makeup. Any other responses or questions about that? None. It's all right. Well, let's talk a minute about the choice to love that Nouwen talks about. Back to, who was it that had that quote earlier, Lee?
That was Sandra Dickinson.
Okay.
But wait a minute. I should put on the microphone. Miranda just said, as if the team were all being recognized and celebrated, and each person honored no matter the part, and not just having a single MVP in the midst of others.
Yeah, teams learn that, right? That you have the star player, but you might have the MVP, but it really depends upon the whole team to do that. Teams get that, don't they? That's a great analogy for us. Instead of comparing in a team that works well, we find our place in a team. We find where our strengths are, and that's what we work from. I don't need to be like someone else. One of the things I sometimes say is, sometimes I feel in life like I'm out of position. Sometimes we look like a catcher, someone with a catcher gear on, and they're playing center field. That's just not right. That's not where they belong. But we find our place in a team. Yeah, good stuff. Back to the quote from earlier. What does it mean to choose to love? Or when is it a choice to be loved? I think there's two sides of that coin that he talks about quite well in this book. There's a couple of sentences in the middle of the chapter, and I think this is the one that she mentioned earlier. But the story of the father and his lost sons powerfully affirm that it was not I who chose God, but God who first chose me. And this is the great mystery of our faith. We do not choose God, God chooses us. Now, we talked a couple of weeks ago about the younger son looking like a prisoner and a newborn child. And we've talked about the parental love of the father in the painting. And it reminded me that when a child is born, the father looks at the son in this painting just as if he were a newborn child. And to love a newborn child is one of the easiest things to do. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to the hospital, and it always floors me. It almost feels mysterious to hold a baby for the first time that's only been in the world for a few hours. I mean, that's amazing to me. And yes, you love that kid. You love that child. You just can't help it. And for me, that's one of the moments I really think about. It reminds me it's the closest thing sometimes to me of what it feels like to love God, of God's love for us. But as we get older, our love can be measured, as we've talked about. And sometimes we're slow to love, and we find it difficult to love. And we can sometimes assume that others don't love us, or we tell ourselves that they have a good reason not to love us. But this is not true with God. But it can be for us. And as Lee mentioned earlier, she's right, and I think that's what one of the challenges that Now One reminds us of is our experiences in life make it sometimes hard to love people and even hard to love God. As much as our ideas and experiences in life shape our images of God for the good, experiences in life can make it hard to have good ideas of who God is. And that's one of the challenges that we face. We disappoint people, and then we assume, well, I can't be loved fully. Parents disappoint us, and we get harmed by the world. And Now One wrote, that to overcome these things, we need to find the depth of God's love. He says, the question is not, how am I to find God? But how am I to let myself be found by God? The question is not, how am I to know God? But how am I to let myself be known by God? And finally, the question is not, how am I to love God? But how am I to let myself be loved by God? And he conveys that he discovered himself that God doesn't make it difficult to be found, but we make it hard to find God. And we let things like guilt and self-esteem and depleted senses of self-worth get between us and understanding that love as well.
We accept the love that we think we deserve.
We accept the love, Julie says, we accept the love we think we deserve. And I think that reminds me too, and so for folks who are online, what do you think it means to choose to love, and what do you think it means to choose to be loved? One of the things I've also heard, and I think can be true, is our inability to love others is a reflection of our ability or inability to love ourselves too. So if I find it hard to love others, I'm probably finding it hard to love myself. I don't know if that's always true, but I think it's a good wisdom to lean into as well. Any other thoughts about what it means to choose to love or to choose to be loved? What did y'all think about the story of the young man in the book who was depressed and sad? And now it says this was someone who was loved by everybody. He was praised. He was appreciated by so many people. But at the same time, he never felt like he deserved it. He always felt like if what's going to happen, when people figure out who I really am, will they still love me? And I think that's true too. And so we can as we read, that we can live our whole lives never fully sure that we're loved as much as we are by God. And the painting and the parable, and they're ripe with this idea. When you look at this painting, it speaks to how God's love exists in a free way, in a full way. And you can see him choosing to love, and you can see the sons choosing whether or not they're going to be loved as well.
Sandra says that now and also says, God is looking into the distance for me, trying to find me, longing to bring me home.
So yeah, that gets back to something earlier, and I think that was one of the images of the mothering hen. It's a great quote, Sandra, as I think about it, because this image of God here, of the Father, is someone who initiates the search, but is also waiting beyond hope in that. And what parents don't do that? When you said that, it reminded me, as a kid, I grew up in a household with my grandmother. And I was always home by 10 o'clock, right? No. And I would, on the way to the kitchen in our house that we grew up in, my grandmother's room was right next to the kitchen. And if I came in a little bit later than I was supposed to, out of the dark, I would hear my grandmother say, "About time you got home." But that always, and I don't know if I knew at the time, but looking back on those moments, that was her waiting up for me. She could not go to sleep until I got home. So she was going to wait for me that whole time. Yeah. I remember Marty said last week that this is an image of the ever-flowing fountain of God's love. An inexhaustible, motherly, fatherly love shown in the way that guides every part of our daily lives. And so this is a boundless, unfettered choice to love for us. But the challenge for you and me, you and I, is to find our ability within ourselves to let ourselves be loved and to let ourselves love others unconditionally.
Okay, Becky says, I think we need to look through the eyes of God, not our own low self-esteem.
Yeah, looking through the eyes of God, not our own self-esteem. And I'm wondering, and I think I'm wondering too if she senses in that we have to learn to love in a way. That it takes practice to love. We don't do it perhaps easily or naturally, and for a lot of the reasons we've talked to, but we practice love. And that's how we learn to love. And so that makes me too wonder, how can we do that? How can we learn to receive God's love? How can we learn to love others? Yeah.
Well, I think there's sometimes, I don't know really how to say this, but receiving love and giving love doesn't always mean everything's puppies and rainbows. That to love someone, truly, you still discipline them. You still, you can love them unconditionally. My parents loved me unconditionally. I still got grounded when I messed up.
So love is more than a sentiment, than what I hear you saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's not always, okay, that's great. But I mean, sometimes you have to learn, and lessons are hard sometimes.
Yeah, and I think that's what I was hoping to convey Sunday. And one of the stories I shared about a father whose kid didn't want to go to bed. But the loving thing to do is get that kid to bed. But the kid was making it difficult, so the father was gentle at first, and then he kind of snaps at the end, and he says to him, I love you, like it or not, but you're going to go to bed. And so, yeah, if we love is a sentiment. We want to feel love. I don't want to say that love ought not to feel good, but sometimes the loving thing to do can be gut-wrenching, can't it? It can be the hardest thing to do. Some of the most loving things that we ever do can be some of the hardest days that we face as well. But it's still loving. Yeah. Are there any others?
Not right now.
All right. I want to talk about two more things before we finish tonight. And the first is celebrations. What does the celebration look like? And this painting, for me, makes it hard to talk about celebration because there's not much celebrating in this painting, but we'll kind of come to that. But want to come back to the question that says, what does the Father teach us about celebrating things before they come to fullness or conclusion. What's it mean to celebrate? Can we celebrate too early, or maybe we call it a pre-celebration? And I'll try to flesh that out a little bit. But now and wrote for us that celebration belongs in God's kingdom. And God not only offers forgiveness, reconciliation, and healing, but wants to lift up these gifts as a source of joy for all who witness them. In all three parables, which Jesus tells to explain why he eats with sinners, God rejoices and invites others to rejoice with him. Rejoice with me, the shepherd says. I have found my sheep that was lost. Rejoice with me, the woman says. I have found the coin I lost. Rejoice with me, the father says. This son of mine was lost and is found. And what Nowan has pointed out for us is that consistently, God's voice is speaking joy and celebration. This Lent, most of our preaching texts, if I'm not mistaken, have this voice of God speaking in to the moment saying, this is my son whom I love. We keep hearing that repeated all this Lent and all those studies. And again, in this story, you get the same thing. This is my beloved. I think the first week we said you can imagine the father in this story whispering, you are my beloved son, no matter what. It's this, we read of the joy of angels, the celestial host. We have songs of angels. We have the songs of saints from the eternal kingdom in the scriptures, and all of them are joy. And when I look at this painting, though, this is one of those, I don't see celebration here. So we have to lean into the story that we read. As we look at it in this moment on the painting, we see a moment. And we're left to guess what's going to happen next. Now, we know that a party's going to begin, though. It's coming. But what we don't know is if the older son's going to join in. That's still up in the air for us. But what we do know is the father wants them both there. So whether or not the older son comes, we're going to have a party. We're going to celebrate, with or without you. Full or unfull, we're going to celebrate. We're going to have this party, even though we don't know if the older son's going to make it home or not. And Nowan writes that God rejoices, not because the problems of the world have been solved, not because all human pain and suffering have come to an end, nor because thousands of people have been converted and are now praising him for goodness. No, God rejoices because one of his children who was lost has been found. And what I'm called to do is enter into that joy. So it's not just the older son who we wonder. Jesus is asking the Pharisees, are you going to step into this joy of these sinners, those you see as not part of the kingdom? Are you going to step into the joy of what I'm doing here? And he suggests that we perhaps don't readily rejoice before things come to a full conclusion in life. So I want to ask us, what does the Father teach us about celebrating things before they come to the conclusion? Can you all think of a time or a way for which we in the church or in your life you have celebrations of things that haven't happened yet? What might some of those be? Can Easter be one of those things? I'll ask that. We're heading to Easter. And Easter is a celebration of Christ rising from the dead, a resurrection. But it preempts the fullness of God redeeming the world. We still live in a hurting world at times, a broken world. But we celebrate the resurrection as if the fullness of God has been seen. And it has, but it also hasn't. So Easter, as we get to that Sunday and beyond, Easter's not the end of the story. It's a beginning. It's the start of something. It's the starting point. One of the hymns that came to mind for me this week is Wade in the Water. We're all familiar with that one, perhaps. You're probably singing it in your head, Wade in the water. Well, it's a hymn that has its roots, and it was sung by those who lived in the reality of slavery in America. And it's a story, Wade in the Water, of Israel escaping bondage in Egypt. And it was sung by people who never tasted the freedom that they sing about. So when you and I sing that hymn, we're singing a hymn that was born in slavery. It was a hymn that was born in those who never tasted the freedom they sang about, but they celebrated what God had done before, God will do again. And that's true in all the spirituals. If you listen to those, they all have their origins in we're celebrating something that's going to happen, but hasn't happened yet. We see glimpses of this glory, but we still celebrate. So I want to pause there. Any other thoughts about celebrating before the fullness or celebrating things before they happen?
Well, in a sense, I guess Christmas would be the same way, because Advent is a season of preparing, and not just preparing for the birth of Christ, but also preparing for the second coming of Christ. Mm-hmm. And so by celebrating Christmas, we're kind of saying it happened, and it hasn't. It's the very same thing as Easter.
Yeah, Advent, which that good church word, Advent is waiting for Christ to come, and Christ came as a child. But that was yet another beginning, right? The fulfillment of that promise came, but then that just led to a whole nother beginning for us. Yeah.
Your wife says that we celebrate each small step of recovery.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the first week we were here, Marty mentioned, I don't think this is what Kim's talking about specifically, but Marty had mentioned recovery community, the addiction recovery community. That today's a celebration. And when we say things in the church like, what are you thankful for? I'm thankful for today. Today's a celebration. Today's a gift. And we have joy in that. It may not be our easiest day ever, but it also reminds me too that recovery means that we're not fully healed. But we can celebrate what we know to be true. We can celebrate what is coming for us as well. Yeah.
Could you think of baptism that way?
Julie asked if we could think of baptism that way.
If you're celebrating the trial before.
Absolutely. Right. We believe as a Methodist Church in infant baptism, and we are celebrating what God's going to do, right? We're celebrating in the communion, in the liturgy of baptism, we're celebrating that we are going to participate in this child's faith. We make a promise for what we're going to do, and we make a big deal out of it that day. But nothing's happened, right? None of that's been accomplished. But we celebrate it like it is the day, because it is the day that we promised to do that as well. Yeah. There's this sense for us as a church that we have, that God's kingdom has come in its fullness, but not all the way. And that we have one foot in God's kingdom and we have one foot in the world. We know the fullness of God and we know the incompleteness of the world. And we can do both. And we celebrate this and we live in this. And the two don't oppose each other, they work together. And that's faith. Faith is the brokenness, back to the painting. Faith is the brokenness and the beauty living together. It's all one. Faith is not the joy. It's the joy in the darkness. It's the joy in the suffering. It's the hope. It's the light in the dark. It's all those things, all in once. You can't have one without the other. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is foolishness.
Wait.
Oh,
Kyle,
go ahead. Yep, go ahead.
Kyle said it's when we celebrate winning a game, but not the season.
Celebrating winning the game, but not a season.
Lots of sports analogies this
Yeah, a
evening.
lot of sports fans. Y'all watching basketball while we're doing this? Is that going on tonight?
Starts at 8.
Starts at 8?
Yeah.
Hurry up, preacher. Yeah, we celebrate a victory. And as soon as you've said that, I'm thinking of, that team that hasn't won in 30 years. Or maybe you have a team that's lost, and they finally won one game and it's a big deal because it's a big deal. But yeah, absolutely. Were there any others, Lee? I don't want to move too fast.
I don't have anything else.
Okay.
There's an unfinished
So I want to ask us and come back to for a final thought. Can we embrace the foolishness that is the love of God? How can we embrace the foolishness that is the love of God? We read that now and to say, surely I will be called naive, unrealistic, and sentimental, and I will be accused of ignoring the real problems, the structural evils that underlie much of human misery. But God rejoices when one repentant sinner returns. Statistically, that's not very interesting, but for God, numbers never matter. If we are to love as God loves, it seems, we will have to let go of the voices that tell us the small and the incomplete things and realities of life are not worth expressing joy for. And we also read that it is the joy of belonging to the household of God, whose love is stronger than death and who empowers us to be in the world while already belonging to the kingdom of joy. In short, we can learn to sing in the darkness. And to the world, that sounds a little strange. The world tells us that joy is the absence of sorrow. But for us, as followers of Christ, joy exists in the sorrow. And that is a powerful message that looks foolish to the world. And Jesus often said that. Peter thought Jesus was being foolish when he talked about enduring the cross. So he pulls him to the side. He doesn't say foolish, but he's treating Jesus like, that's crazy. That's foolishness. Don't say that. Jesus often talked about looking foolish to the world. 1 Corinthians chapter 1:27 says, God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. So how can we embrace foolishness? And as you think about that, a lighthearted thing that a friend of mine used to do to his kids, which I didn't do to mine. I always said I was, but I didn't. I had a friend who would, every year on his child's birthday, would take shoe polish and he'd write all over his car that it's my son's birthday today. He put his name on the windows. He had windows hanging out the car, and he would drive him to the school drop-off line. And he would sing happy birthday to his son as he walked into the church building. Now, the son was used to this, but he wanted to make a big deal in front of everybody. It wasn't perhaps a big deal to everyone. Most people probably didn't know that it was his son's birthday. But his job was to embarrass him that he loved him so much. To show, I'm so excited for you, I need the world to see this. And it probably looked a little foolish when he did that. But I think there's a little bit of truth in that when we name our hurts and when we're honest about them, we can share those with God. But we can rejoice that God, Father and Mother, will always have the last word for us. So we don't express joy and faith for anything more than or anything less than the fact that we know that none of these hardships, none of these struggles, none of them are going to have the last word. So we can always find joy. There's always joy to be found. So how about you all? Anything that you all can think of what it looks like to embrace the foolishness of God's love?
Before that one, Ann Pfister commented, just as you started into that next part, the father is celebrating, the younger son is grateful, and the older brother is recounting the sins of his younger brother. Just to sum up what's going on.
Yeah, and as we look, I was going to ask us to finish by looking at the pain, and what would be the signs of foolishness here? For the older son. Go ahead.
I have great difficulty being foolish.
I have a picture of your garb for Sunday in the children's event, please, so I don't think that's true.
But I would say embracing foolishness sometimes is getting up, Sunday I'll have a costume on, but doing VBS and other things and just acting completely crazy for Jesus.
Yeah.
And it looks foolish obviously, but if you're filled with joy, then you can bring other people into that joy sometimes by being overly foolish and crazy.
Yeah, and please know when I say foolish, I don't actually mean foolishness. I mean the opposite of that. It makes me wonder, what would the opposite of foolishness be? Maybe, that's an interesting thought. Is the opposite of foolishness just pure joy? Is this unabated love and joy? And that's what we would call it. The world says, and as we look at this painting, I can imagine the son saying, well, this is just foolish. That he would welcome him back home as he's doing. It's foolish to bring out the calf, the fatted calf for him. This makes no sense whatsoever. And for us, we say, yes, it is. It makes no sense. It makes no sense to the world. But it makes all the sense in God's kingdom. It makes all the sense in the world. And perhaps one of the last images that come to mind just randomly as I'm saying that is Jesus on the cross next to the thief. And his word to him at that moment is, you will spend eternity with me in paradise. That's a foolish thing to say at that moment to the world. But for us, we understand that. Yeah.
Well, we think it's foolish for the shepherd to leave the 99.
Yeah, it's foolish to leave. Yeah, it's foolish for the shepherd to, that makes no good business sense. Right, Julie's saying it's foolish to leave the 99 sheep to go find the one. Well, if you're a shepherd, no way. Because all of my resources are bound up in those 99, but now I'm going to leave them at risk to go get that one. So many stories say the same thing. So many stories are like that. It really turns upside down what we're doing. And this story and this painting turns all of that upside down as well.
I keep thinking of an anthem that we sing, and there are several people on tonight that are in choir. It's called Somewhere It's Snowing. It's a poem by Stephanie Usuda, something like that. But it talks about how snow is like grace covering the earth, and that they say when one man turns away from sin and goes to God, it's like it's snowing grace down upon the earth is kind of the epiphany. So I always, when I think of grace and going after that one person, that song always comes through my head that obviously somewhere it's snowing, somebody is turning from sin and going to the Lord at all times.
Yeah. And as you're saying that, I'm looking at the painting thinking, this story makes no sense, does it? It really doesn't, because to give the son, the father gives the son the insignia ring, and he gives him a robe. And that insignia ring that the father gives him means, it's pretty much, it's not necessarily his business card, but that says, anyone who sees that ring says, he's making decisions on the family's behalf again. He doesn't earn his way back in. He becomes a full-fledged member of this family again. He's given all the responsibilities of a family member again. And that older brother must have been thinking, oh my, really? And so it feels precarious. And maybe that's what it feels like. Maybe it feels precarious for us to love as we're called to love as well. Excellent stuff, good stuff. What I haven't mentioned each week, I want to remind you of before we finish, and we're going to sing a hymn and close in prayer. I've included in the study guide the personal journal questions, and these are for you. And maybe these could be helpful for you in the week ahead as we ponder this text together. Take those with you, journal with them if you like to, and reflect with them. But in general, how can we learn from the Father's love and apply it to our life? Next week, we have one more study. We're going to look at how we put all this together, and perhaps that'll be more of a conversation around community. The week after that, of course, is going to be Holy Week. And I'll share details next week about Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, and Easter Sunday as well then. So let's sing our hymn, and in a moment we'll close in prayer for the evening.
I invite you to join us in singing Come Ye Sinners, Poor and Needy.
It's on.
Come ye sinners, poor and needy, weak and wounded, sick and sore, Jesus ready stands to
I like the line, that hymn that reminds us that we need not wait till we're ready to go to God, because God already loves us here in those words. So let's close with prayer by this litany for our end of this evening. May God, whose hand has written the law of love upon your heart, fill you with peace from deep within and the commitment to live in harmony. And may the blessing of God, who loves, forgives, and calls us home, be with us now and always. God bless and good night. See you Sunday, and hope to see you back here next Wednesday.